Hello, Sid Smith. My name's Sean Hewitt. I'm at home actually this week. I'm not anywhere special. I'm not in a geosynchronous orbit or 1,000 miles beneath the Earth's surface. Where are you, Sid?
Um, I'm on the Martian satellite Demos.
Right, that's very good. What's it like there?
It's fucking raining.
What, a Mars?
Yeah.
You've got some bad luck. Anyway, we're now looking at what are in fact the final three records
Oh.
in Idiot Wins' wonderfully speedy odyssey through 43 Bob Dylan albums as part of the Agostini Dylan Vinyl, the definitive collection. And we're meandering our way on a musical odyssey that has reinvigorated Sid and restored his faith in the music world. Anyway, we're a bit unusual, these albums, in that there's three releases totaling 5 CDs or 5 LPs. We're looking at the LPs this week because we're both keen listeners to the LPs, and none of them contain a single song written by Bob Dylan. So and that's really cheered Sid up because he's a huge fan of Bob, and he loves the longer songs. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at these 3 albums, which I'm now going to hold up in a jaunty fashion. They are Bob's American Songbook records. Just let me organise these for you. And these are called Shadows in the Night. I'll hold them up in a minute. Shadows in the Night, Fallen Angels, and Triplicate. Of these records, the first 2 were recorded in the same sessions, and I think the Triplicate sessions were a couple of years after. The lineups for these records are very much either very similar or identical. Basically, this is a nightmare. Hello, these are the 3 albums. I you've got that, Sid, with your camera. Yeah, eagerly taking a photograph there. Let's look at these are the CDs of these albums, which are far easier to wrangle. I've just got these out after our earlier practice went tits up. So those are the CDs there. And of course, each of these albums comes with a fabulous magazine. And as you can see, the cover art on each of these is, I'll hold them like this for you, Sid, because you seem to like this configuration. They're just the same as the album covers. Very imaginative, I thought, on the part of the designers and editors and the huge journalistic team that makes up the Diagastini. And in this one, which is Shadows in the Night, you can see this great photo of a Bob and a mystery woman. And anyone's wondering who that is. Some people think that's Meg White of the White Stripes. Bob does know Jack White. I don't know. Oh, if you wonder where they got that picture from, this is the album cover. It's on the back of the album there. It's a brilliant feat of picture research as ever. And just look at that. Tremendous. Right, and then we've got the Fallen Angels one. That's a picture of Bob, I think, from Love and Theft or somewhere, or from somewhere around that time, isn't it? Time Out of Mind, Love and Theft. Nothing to do with this session. So there's that one, and then there's Triplicate. One of the most imaginative of Bob's later album covers. I don't know how they came up with that. That's a really arty design, and very, very nice portrait of Bob there. This is very quite moody, and if you wonder where that's from, I don't want to disillusion anyone, but it's in this there's an insert and it's on there. So so they've just ripped off bits of the album covers again, and a fabulous, informative magazine. I must say, we're coming to the end of this now. Those are the last of the magazines we'll see. And I've been initially looking at the Beatles set, which I think you've got, haven't you? The Dio Gastini Beatles set. And the magazines are proper magazines there, aren't they? I mean, they're not, as you say to me, they're not, you're not going to be going back to them and using them as reference works, but at least there's been some effort
Yeah.
And there's more picture research. There's a proper written article by Kevin Howlett, who nowadays writes sleeve notes for the Beatles box sets. And I think these are a disgrace. Actually, these magazines. When you've got someone who's generated as much imagery and words as Bob Dylan about him and by him, it's a bit rubbish what they've done with those magazines. There's no way there's not enough material about Bob Dylan. Anyway, what was Bob Dylan thinking when he decided to make 5 LPs worth of Frank Sinatra era songs? A few things, actually. The last studio album Bob made before this was Tempest, and that's got its strengths and its big weaknesses. One of the weaknesses is his voice, and Bob thought his voice was poor on Tempest, and he was sitting around looking for a way to challenge his singing. And one way to do that, of course, is to do a range of songs you haven't had any part in writing, which will put the focus on. He's not got to focus on doing a version of his own lyric. He's focusing on somebody else's lyric, and that means focusing more on his voice. And it also means the listener will be forced to listen to his voice. Also, he's got a great interest in Frank Sinatra. He was a friend of Frank Sinatra. When Frank Sinatra's 85th birthday party, he asked Dylan to appear, and he asked him to play a specific song, A Restless Farewell. They get on very well, Dylan and Sinatra, and Dylan also is a fan of Sinatra. He's a fan of the albums, and he's interested in a lot of the songs Sinatra used to sing. These are songs from an era before Bob and the Beatles broke the back of that kind of pop music and replaced it with something different. And despite that, Bob does have a great affection for that music, and he feels a debt to its craft. He thinks the craft of these songs is astonishing, and has always felt that. And it's almost like there's a bit of guilt of what they did to the music. I mean, Paul McCartney recently did an album called Kisses on the Bottom, which was again all songs from pre-Beatles era, and it's not quite so surprising with McCartney, because McCartney's always had that love of that old-fashioned songwriting, and can write those songs at the drop of a hat. He can sound like Cole Porter. He can sound like a musical song from the 1920s, you know. But there is a sense of interest in this music and a debt to be paid, I think. And he had very firm views, and I wanted to record this. The engineer on all these sessions is a guy called Al Schmidt, who died. He was 91 in 2021. He was, at the time of recording these albums, one of the longest serving recording engineers in American recording industry. He started off working with producers like Tom Dowd as a very young man. One of his first sessions was working with Duke Ellington, telling Duke Ellington throughout the session, I'm really not qualified to do this, you know. And Duke Ellington saying, don't worry, kid, we'll get through it. And of course, in that session, they did 4 tracks in 3 hours that were released, you know. Those were the days. And he went on to work with Thelonious Monk, with movie composers like Alex North and Lalo Schifrin. He worked with Neil Young. He produced a few tracks on, what's the album? On the Beach. And he produced with Jackson Browne the album Late for the Sky.
Yeah.
And he worked with Jefferson Starship and people like Jefferson Airplane, as they were then, sorry, bands like that. So he got a foot in several camps. Towards the end of his career, he actually worked with Michael Jackson and Madonna and people like that, when he was an engineer for the producer Tommy LaPuma. But Dylan had seen his name on a lot of albums, and he's seen his name on a duets album done by Frank Sinatra. And he asked his manager, Jeff Rosen, to call Al Schmidt, not realizing that one of Al Schmidt's bucket list artists he'd never worked with, he wanted to work with, was Bob Dylan. He got the call and then realized his schedule, this was a busy man to the very late in his life, didn't allow him to do it. And he wouldn't be able to make the sessions. So he very regretfully turned it down to Jeff Rosen. And the following day, Jeff Rosen rang him back and said, I've been talking to Bob. We'll reschedule the session so we can get you. We'll reschedule the session so we can work with you. So tell us when you're free, and we'll do the sessions then. And he said he'd never known anything like that in his career, for an artist to do that. The sessions were also recorded at Capital B Studio in Los Angeles which is a studio where Frank Sinatra heavily worked. He was a very frequent recorder there, and it was chosen for that reason. Dylan, on his first visit to it, remarked to Al Schmidt's assistant how great the sound was just talking in the room, and where would be a good place for him to sing from. And the assistant said, "Well, right there where you're standing now, but just as good as anywhere." And so when they recorded this is a very simple set of recordings. The band are playing live. There's no overdubs, there's no edits, there's no fixers. On a lot of the tracks, there's not even any mixing. They just went straight and printed it. Al Schmidt devised what he thought was a sensitive mixing strategy for these songs. Bob said, "It sounds great. It's just playing in the room. What, I don't want anything to come between what's happening in the room and the listener, you know." There are only 7 microphones used in these sessions, and Bob thought there were too many. He said, "Can we get some of these microphones out of my line of sight?" So they moved some, and they disguised others. But there's only 7 microphones. When they recorded the horns, the only other people on this, apart from Bob and his band, are the horns. They put them in another room and left the doors open so Bob could hear them while he was singing. And if they wanted the bass louder, they got Tony Garnier, who was the musical director on these sessions. He bought the chord sheets and all that, and they worked out the arrangement from what he brought in, and Bob told them what they wanted to be tempo. And if they wanted the bass louder, they got him to stand nearer Bob, and if they wanted him to be quieter, they got him to move further away. When the electric guitar player plays a solo, the guitar player turns the volume up. So that's it. So they had, for the first sessions, there were 2 3-hour sessions a day, 5 days a week for 3 weeks. And I believe that produced all the songs for the first 2 albums, Shadows in the Night and Fallen Angels. I think the second sessions were the same band minus one of the guitarists, Stu Kimball, in the same studio. They were a year or 2 later with Al Schmidt again, and they did Triplicate then. These albums got very good reviews, and I must say, one thing, I'm taking the mickey out of the vinyl collection, but these records sound lovely. I particularly thought this album, the second one, sounded spectacular on vinyl. It sounds really warm. It sounds really like you're hearing them in the room, and a lovely, subtle sound. And not often you can say that about some of these records we listen to in this series, but I thought this was a beautiful sounding record, particularly all of them, but this one in particular. What did you think of these records?
I approached them with some trepidation.
Yeah, I don't blame you.
Because although to be fair, I approach most Bob Dylan albums with trepidation.
I think we've established that.
I sort of going at it backwards, as it were. I thought Triplicate was fantastic. Of the 3 distinct
yeah.
I think Triplicate is just something really special. I haven't got the vinyl because I had to stave off bankruptcy and bail out from buying these LPs on vinyl. So I'm listening to them on a streaming service, Quorbooks.
Yes, they're very high quality one though.
But it's high res audio, and I'm listening to them on decent headphones, etc. And they sounded great. I mean, all 3 albums sound good, but there's something about Triplicate. I returned to Triplicate a couple of times. I on one occasion, I'd woken up, and I this sounds like a backhanded compliment. It's not meant that way. I wanted to get back to sleep, and I put me headphones on, and I put Triplicate on, and actually being in that sort of on the cusp of going to sleep, and on the cusp of being awake, hearing this music drift on Triplicate, hearing this music drift around, was actually kind of, it was a lovely experience actually. I have listened to the album a couple of more times, fully awake, and
Hooray!
at a reasonable time of day. And for me, there's a lot. I found a lot to like in these albums. I mean, I read, Bob Dylan's breathing life into new life into these old songs, and actually, as you indicated in your introduction, it's actually the other way around. These old songs are breathing new life into Bob Dylan.
Oh, that's a lovely way of saying it.
And there's a couple of reasons why it seemed to me. One was the choice of material. Anything from the Great American Songbook. It's called the Great American Songbook for a reason. Each one of these songs on any of these albums, I mean, they're a masterclass in songwriting. That's the thing. They're even the ones which are fairly knockoff and trivial. They've still got good introductions. They've got their form and structure is perfect. Chords are crafted to carry beautiful melodies, and those beautiful melodies in turn are gifted some of the sharpest observations on the human condition by way of these smart, insightful lyrics.
Yes.
So, and there's a lot of dense information packed into a very, very short period of time. I mean, as you indicated earlier, I mean, these are the songs from the 20s, 30s, 40s, and even into the 50s. These are the sort of templates for popular songs. I mean, this is where the term comes from. But there's another reason why these albums worked for me, and it's something that to my ears, you don't often get on a Dylan album, and that is performance. Dylan actually stands in front of the microphone and honors these songs, pays respect to these songs, and he doesn't turn up with his arse hanging out of his trousers. He turns up smart and dressed properly for the occasion, as it were. And he honors the melody. There's a melody here, and there's a reason why all singers interpret melodies. Sinatra did it, better than most. But these melodies are there for a reason. They work at a particular level with the chords, and Dylan does this quite well, I think. Usually on a Bob Dylan album, I've said this before, whatever the idea is for the song, often Dylan's music for his own material is cursory at best. It's the most basic kind of slung together chord sequence, which he's fairly indifferent to, so that he can ladle on top, at some length, whatever it is he wants to go on about. With this material, you can't do that. It's not like that. You've got to actually address the material. You've got to sing the words, and for some, words are, as you've indicated on numerous occasions, it's why Bob Dylan's famous. Where would we be without the Chinese diplomat, after all? But
we'll be on these broadcasts.
What we get here is these words, which sometimes sound quaint, sometimes sound oldie-worldy, but actually there's a lot of truth in these words. I mean, that's why these songs are popular. They speak a certain kind of truth. And yes, there's a certain rosy tinted spectacle aspect to these words. But he goes in for them, and he honors the melody and engages with it in a way that he's not required to when it's his material. And so I actually came out of these albums with a lot of respect for what Bob Dylan had done with them. He didn't try and Dylanize them.
No.
This isn't Bob Dylan doing something to these words, these songs. Just in passing, the backing is sweet. It's beautifully done. The band are just perfect. And it reminded me, you talking about the quality of the sound, it reminded me, obviously I know the context about the, like in Dylan, like in Sinatra and stuff. And I'd for no particular reason, I'd been listening to some Sinatra in recent times. And one of the things I love about those Sinatra records is the sound of the room. And you can hear it on all the Sinatra albums, where basically nothing is mixed.
No.
They're called balance engineers, and
Yeah.
and people are placed. The guy who plays the great trombone solo in "I've Got You Under My Skin" stands on a box, so he's above the other guys, so the sound projects.
Yeah.
And it's little things like that, as you described, in the making of these albums. So for me, there's just some great stuff comes together, and I think Dylan does a great job with these albums. I would, of the three, Triplicate is definitely
Triplicate is really
my
impressed you,
favorite.
hasn't it?
I don't mind. I don't mind the other two. I think they're perfectly fine. I think that there's something about the song selection on Triplicate really, conceptually flows really well.
Well, when he presented this album, the thought of the record company was the length of the album would fit onto 2 LPs or 2 CDs. And he specifically said, I want 3 32-minute records.
Right. Yeah.
Separate. And these have all got separate CD1, Till the Sun Goes Down, CD2, Devil Dolls, CD3, Coming Home Late. And he said he wanted them to have this continuous mood that would lead into the next one.
Yeah.
And he demanded there were 3 records. But they're each would only be 32 minutes long. That's what he said. Al Schmidt, also I forgot to say, the interview with Al Schmidt by Paul Tingen, who wrote a very good book on Miles Davis.
Yeah,
he interviewed him at some length about the first of these albums, Al Schmidt. And Al Schmidt said he was, a bit worried about how will he approach it. But when he turned up, he said they were very prepared, and he'd spoken to his band at length about it. Often they'd start the session, and they always played the Sinatra version. They listened to it on Dylan's music setup. They all sat and listened to it, and then they had a discussion that could be an hour or two about the song and what the song was about and how he wanted to approach it. And then they do a few takes, and they pick one of the takes, and that was it.
I didn't know that, but it kind of doesn't surprise me. I think one of the big criticisms I have of Dylan's work in the studio is the cursory nature of it. It's dashed off often, and one of the things I really responded to on these records is how it's not like that. It's carefully done. It's lovingly done. It's not reverential. It's a living, breathing song. And
if it was reverential, you'd have a big orchestra and he'd be trying to do that. But he's deliberately gone for these stripped back arrangements.
It's the scale and size. Everything's appropriate.
Yes.
And Dylan's voice, which carries the tunes beautifully, I think. This is an older man who doesn't necessarily who doesn't necessarily have the control and the range that a younger person would have, but knowing, but there he is placed in front of a microphone with this group around him, and everything is beautifully proportioned. The consideration of the material, the performance of it, Dylan's vocal on it. There's nothing. What's not to like.
One thing I would say, leading on from what you've just said, is he sounds like he means it on this record. When he's singing these songs, he sounds like he means them. He's not trying to subvert them. He's not trying to do anything clever. He's trying to inhabit the song. In his own comments, he said, people say I'm covering these songs. They've been covered for years. They've been covered to death, he said. I'm trying to uncover them. And I think that's a nice way of looking, trying to uncover what the emotion that sparked the song and
Yeah.
what the song's about. So they got very good reviews. I mean, a couple of these songs still survive in the set. Around when he was touring after these albums came out, he began to introduce these old songs among his own material. But even as late as the tour he did last year, he did that old Black Magic last year, and earlier gigs he did Melancholy Mood. He likes those songs. He likes Melancholy Mood. He did several when I saw him in Nottingham, about 2017. He did several of these songs, and he seemed very energized by them. Sometimes you get the feeling Dylan is going through an ordeal on stage, but he was picking up the microphone and walking around singing them. He was ignoring instrumentation and he was crooning them into a microphone he was holding in his hand. And whenever he does that old Black Magic, he becomes very animated, and it was lovely to see. And there was no sense of taking the Mickey. There was no sense of subversion. He loves these songs, and I'm surprised. When they first came out, I thought, Christ, he's doing Frank Sinatra songs now. What next? What next, Bob? But over the years, I'm particularly listening to them in detail for this, I've been very moved by some of these songs, and I've been very impressed by the albums. I think they're warm. I think they're heartfelt, and I think his singing is at a different dimension here to On Tempest. And I think he's deliberately trying to stretch himself.
Yeah.
And I think that bears fruit on the records that come after this.
Yeah. What are the records that follow the Triplicate, for example?
Well, the next one after he releases after Triplicate is Rough and Rowdy Ways. That's his only original album since then, but he's also released an album called Shadow Kingdom, which is him doing his old songs in a very stripped back way.
Right.
So I think you can hear vocally on those records the fruit of this experiment. His voice is much smoother and much more approachable on these albums than it is on Tempest.
Yeah, yeah.
And he's putting effort into, you can hear the words that he's writing. So I think for that alone, these are valuable albums. I think he's refound his voice through doing this, which he was aware was a problem. His voice can be a problem now, but he's taken serious steps to restore a different kind of vocal to his records. And I also think in and of themselves, they are surprisingly touching records. And a man in his autumn years singing these songs about people in their autumn years, often, and it has an emotional effect. It's undeniable. He's also very influenced by an album Willie Nelson, who is a friend of his, made Stardust. He's always spoken about that album.
I was going to mention Stardust.
Yeah, in the 80s, he was giving interviews and saying, Willie Nelson's made a great record called Stardust, and I'd love to make a record like that one day. He's obviously had it at the back of his mind for a long time, but he's never actioned it until he gets to this stage in his life. But he was very, very impressed with the Willie Nelson album, and he's often raved about that album.
Yeah, but justifiably so. Stardust is a phenomenally good album.
I've never heard Stardust. I've never heard
it. I think I've got a copy of it somewhere. It's not quite the same as what Dylan's done. In a sense, it's more contemporary sounding. There's not. You could say that the Triplicate and the other albums are sort of, there's quite a deliberate, not retro exactly, but there's a way of phrasing and presenting material. Stardust isn't quite like that. Stardust as I say, has a more contemporary sort of sound to it, but nevertheless, it's great. For me, it sounds like he's turned up. the
Yeah.
big criticism I always have with Bob Dylan
It's
is it
interesting
sounds
to
like
hear
he
you
doesn't
say
turn
this,
up to these.
because this does link up with what you've been saying all the way through. Uh, Also, I mean, there's no doubt that this was a deliberate attempt. Al Schmidt puts it. This is how they made records in the 1950s.
Yeah,
And there's a 56 input desk in the Capital V studio. They only used 8 inputs.
yeah.
That was quite deliberate. That was they all agreed on that going in. It's what's in the room he wanted.
Yeah, yeah, sure. There's you and I have been to Abbey Road, and
Yeah, I'm going again next weekend.
when you go into Studio 2, you know, it has a vibe, you know.
Definitely, you can't believe you're in it.
You can feel it, you know, and when you hear the piano,
Yeah. When you
know,
hear instrumentation in there, you hear the sound of the room.
yeah, yeah,
And the room has a distinct character.
definitely.
Definitely a bizarre.
And the
almost-
joy of these records is that becomes an extra part of the album as much as
Yeah.
the beautiful. I think I don't know who did it, but the person who plays the sort of creamy, dreamy pedal steel guitar. It's a gorgeous sound, you know.
Donny Kimball.
Yeah,
Donny Heron. Sorry, Donny Heron is in band now.
yeah, beautiful work throughout these albums. Brilliant stuff. It sort of seems a bit in the last few minutes of this. It sort of seems a bit, you know, pick one track from each of the albums. I'm not sure I can, but I was taken. It's not on Triplicate, but I did enjoy Autumn Leaves. Which I think is on Shadows in the Night, is it? It might be, it might not be. Wherever it's from, Autumn Leaves. It's a great song.
Yes, it is. It is on this.
Yeah. It's a great song, and you know, it links to the whole notion of he as a performer in the twilight of his years, etc., etc. But honestly, you could just assign me a track from Triplicate, and I'd be happy with it. You know.
Oh, it's nice to hear. I mean, I've got a very strong sentimental attachment to Melancholy Mood and that Old Black Magic, but I think one of my favourite songs on this is also from Shadows in the Night, which is Full Moon and Empty Arms. I think that's a lovely song, and I think he sings it beautifully. I've always liked that one.
Yeah, he does what. As a kid, I grew up with one of my parents' albums, and I've got my own copy of it. The Concert Sinatra. And he does a couple of numbers which were on the Concert Sinatra, recorded in that room. Blah blah blah. Nelson Riddle present, and I've got the earlier Sinatra albums with Gordon Jenkins on the orchestra, and he does a couple on. Dylan does a couple from that album, and they're great. They're just great songs. I mean, they're great songs, and he handles them with due care, attention, and respect, and that's kind of what you want from an artist, you know.
It's great that you've got this background with your parents used to listen to this music. My parents listened to Stormzy.
I forget, with you being so much considerably younger than myself.
Yes, I'm considerably younger than you.
So here we are. We're at the end of the D'Agostini Odyssey.
Yeah, but there's a certain way still to go, Sid. We're going to do a final look back at our wonderful years of doing this podcast, the centuries we've spent walking the ancient highway with Bob, and we'll do one more episode, and we'll say goodbye, and we'll think about what we do with the rest of our lives.
Right. Well, on that note,
on that bombshell.